You ever seen a machine make a whole office freeze? The engine was still ticking when I stepped off the tractor, that slow metallic click-click like it was catching its breath after a long fight. Diesel hanging thick in the morning air, heavy and sharp in the back of my throat, and every single person in that glass-front HOA office just stood there staring at me like I'd just dropped a tank in their parking lot. Because technically, I had 47 years of steel, rust, and family history parked square across their front entrance, blocking both doors clean like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. And the best part was I hadn't broken a single rule doing it. Not one. But they didn't know that yet. Not Brenda. Not her clipboard crew. Not the guy in the polo shirt still holding his coffee halfway to his mouth like time had paused just for him. Because 3 days ago that same office had mailed me a fine. A neat little envelope with my name printed in clean black ink, accusing my tractor of violating community aesthetics, like the machine that fed my land. The machine my father taught me to drive when I was barely tall enough to reach the pedals, was somehow offensive to their perfectly trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes. I remember the feel of that paper between my fingers, thick, expensive, like authority you're supposed to respect, and the smell of fresh printer ink when I tore it open. Standing right there in my gravel driveway, boots crunching under me, sun just coming up over the fence line, and I actually laughed, not loud, just enough to taste how ridiculous it was, because that tractor had been on my property longer than half the people in that neighborhood had been alive, and somehow now it was a problem. Brenda Whitmore made sure of that. She always did. White Lexus. Perfect hair that didn't move even when the wind kicked up. That tight smile like she was doing you a favor while she wrote you up. She showed up 2 days after the letter, heels clicking on my gravel like she owned the ground, holding that clipboard like it was a badge, telling me I had 72 hours to resolve the violation or the fines would escalate daily. Her voice smooth, rehearsed, like she'd said those exact words 100 times before. And I remember looking past her, at my tractor sitting there quiet in the early light, paint faded, metal warm from yesterday's work, and I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about a machine. This wasn't about rules. This was about control, about seeing how far they could push before someone pushed back. And I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't give her the satisfaction. I just nodded like I understood, like I'd play along, and that's what she didn't see. That's what none of them saw when I climbed up into that seat this morning at exactly 6:58 a.m., cold metal under my hands. The smell of diesel filling my lungs as the engine roared to life, deep and steady like it always had, and I pointed it straight down Maple Ridge Drive toward their office. Every rotation of those heavy tires grinding gravel and asphalt the same way my patience had been grinding down over the last 72 hours, because they thought they were enforcing a rule. But what they really did was give me the perfect reason to show them exactly how their own rules worked. I have been around that machine my whole life, long before Willowbrook Estates had sidewalks or matching fences or rules about what shade of beige your mailbox had to be, back when this land still smelled like cut hay and warm dirt, instead of fresh mulch and overpriced landscaping. My father used to say you could tell a man by how he treated his tools, and that tractor sitting out there in front of their office was not just a tool. It was the first thing he ever trusted me with. I was 12 years old, boots 2 sizes too big, hands shaking as I gripped that same steering wheel, the metal hot under the Texas sun, engine rumbling like it had a heartbeat, and he stood there with his arms crossed, not saying much, just watching, letting me figure it out, letting me stall it twice, maybe 3 times, before it finally caught and rolled forward slow and steady. That was the day he told me, son, anything that helps you build something honest deserves respect, and I carried that with me. Through every job, every contract, every long summer day where the smell of diesel mixed with sweat and dust, and you did not stop until the work was done right. So when I bought this property 5 years ago, just under 3 acres on the edge of that neighborhood, I made sure of one thing. The land stayed mine, separate deed, separate access, no HOA control. I paid extra for that line on a survey map, an extra $22,000 just to keep my independence, and for a while it worked. I kept to myself, did my jobs, came home tired, parked the tractor near the barn where it belonged, the evenings. Quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the distant sound of lawn sprinklers ticking in perfect suburban rhythm. But then the neighborhood grew, houses filled in, board meetings started, and somehow that line I paid for stopped meaning what it used to. Brenda Whitmore made sure of that. She had a way of inserting herself into spaces that were never hers to begin with. Always smiling like she was helping. Always holding that clipboard like it gave her authority that extended beyond the rules. The first time she came onto my property, she did not even knock, just walked past the gate like it was decorative, heels sinking slightly into the dirt as she looked around with that same expression people get when they are already planning changes. She told me my equipment was visible from the street, and that visibility affected property values. Like my land existed for her approval. I remember wiping my hands on a rag, grease still under my nails, and explaining calmly that my property was not part of the association, that the tractor was legally parked on private land, that there were no covenants that applied to me. She nodded, wrote something down anyway, and gave me that smile, the one that says this is not over. And she was right. It was not. The letter started a week later. First one polite, then another more formal, then the fine notice. Each envelope thicker than the last. Each word more confident than the last. Like repetition itself could turn something false into something enforceable. And I could feel it building, not just in my mailbox, but in the way neighbors started looking at me when they drove by slower than usual, like they were waiting to see how this played out, like it was entertainment, like I was either going to fall in line or become a problem. And the thing about me is I do not scare easy, but I also do not swing first. I watch, I listen, I read every line twice, because somewhere in all that paper, in all that confidence, there is always a mistake, a detail they overlook because they assume nobody is paying attention. And standing there now, looking at that office door blocked by the very machine they tried to control, I could already feel that mistake sitting right where I needed it to be. Waiting. Brenda Whitmore did not step outside right away. That was the first thing I noticed. She stayed just behind the glass doors with her phone already in her hand, lips tight, eyes locked on me like she was trying to calculate whether this was still something she could control, because that is what people like her do. They do not react. They assess. They measure. They look for angles the same way she used to look at my property line like it was negotiable, and I could see it in the way she tilted her head slightly, the way her fingers hovered over the screen without dialing yet. She was waiting for me to make a mistake, something she could write down, something she could turn into another letter, another fine, another attempt to remind me that she believed this neighborhood answered to her. But I did not move. I just stood there with one hand resting on the warm metal of that tractor, feeling the faint vibration still running through it like it had not quite decided to shut down completely. The smell of diesel mixing with the artificial scent of fresh landscaping around their office, that overly clean smell that never quite covers what is underneath. And then the door finally opened, slow, controlled, like even that had to follow her sense of order. She stepped out onto the concrete in those same heels, not built for gravel, not built for dirt, not built for anything outside the line she liked to draw. And she looked at me with that same practiced smile, only thinner. Now, stretched tight like it was working harder than usual. "Ethan," she said, drawing my name out like we were still in some polite conversation, "you cannot park that here." And there it was, the assumption, the certainty. The belief that this situation worked the same way every other one had worked, that she would state a rule, and I would adjust. And I let the silence hang for a second, long enough for the people inside to press closer to the glass, long enough for a couple of residents walking their dogs to slow down and watch. Phones already halfway out, because nothing pulls attention faster than someone challenging authority in a place built on quiet compliance. And I could feel every pair of eyes shifting between us, waiting to see how this played out. The morning sun catching on the tractor's faded paint, highlighting every scratch, every dent, every year of work it had done without asking permission. And I finally spoke, calm, steady, the same way my father used to when he knew he was right. "Actually, I can." And you could see it hit her, not like a shock, more like a disruption, like a line in her script had just been changed without her approval. She frowned slightly, that clipboard coming up, almost automatically like it could fix the situation just by being there. "This is private HOA property," she said, emphasizing each word like it carried weight, like it was final. And I nodded once, slow, letting her finish, letting her commit to it, because that is the thing about people who rely on authority. They need to say it out loud. They need to hear themselves declare it before they believe it is real. And that is when I pointed, not at her, not even at the building, but at the small metal sign posted near the edge of the lot. half hidden behind a trimmed hedge, something most people would never notice, something I had noticed the second I started reading through their paperwork 3 nights ago under the yellow light in my kitchen. Zoning designation, commercial use, not residential, not HOA restricted land. And I saw the exact moment she realized I was not guessing, that this was not some emotional reaction or stubborn refusal. This was something else, something planned. Something grounded in the same kind of rules she thought only she understood, and her smile dropped just enough to show it. Just enough to tell me I had found the crack. For a second the entire scene shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle change in the air, like pressure dropping before a storm, because Brenda followed my finger to that sign, and I watched her read it. Really read it this time. Not the way people skim when they think they already know the answer, but slowly, carefully, like each word might betray her if she rushed it. Commercial zoning. That small line stamped into metal that most residents drove past every day without ever seeing. And I could almost hear the pieces moving in her head, trying to fit this into her version of control, trying to rewrite what she had already said out loud. And when she looked back at me, the smile was gone, replaced with something tighter, something sharper. Ethan, she said again, but this time my name sounded different. Less like a greeting and more like a problem she had not planned for. This does not change the fact that you are obstructing access. And there it was, the pivot, the shift from authority to interpretation, from rules to arguments. Because when the rules stop working, people like her lean on ambiguity. They stretch definitions until they sound official, and I could feel the eyes around us leaning in closer, people stepping out of their cars, doors left open, a phone camera lifting just a little higher, because now it was not just about a tractor, it was about who was right, and who was about to be proven wrong. I let out a slow breath, tasting diesel and morning air, grounding myself the same way I used to before starting a long job, and I answered her. Without raising my voice. I am not blocking access, I said. I am parked on a commercial lot, in a designated parking space. And if your office cannot operate because of one legally parked vehicle, that sounds like a design problem, not a violation. And the words landed exactly where I wanted them to, not aggressive, not defensive, just precise. Because precision matters when you are dealing with people who rely on loose language to control situations. Her grip tightened on that clipboard, knuckles whitening just enough to show it. And for the first time since she walked out, she glanced past me, not at the tractor, but at the growing crowd, at the quiet shift in attention that was no longer on her authority, but on her response, and that is. When she made her next move, she stepped closer, lowering her voice like this was suddenly a private conversation, like she could pull this back into her comfort zone. We can resolve this without making a scene, she said, her tone soft but edged. Remove the vehicle, and we can review your fine. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed everything. This was never about rules, it was about control, about maintaining the image that she decided what was acceptable and what was not. And I shook my head once, slow and deliberate. No, I said, we are past that. You issued a fine based on rules that do not apply to me. And now I am using the same legal framework you rely on. And I let that hang there, giving it space, letting it settle into the silence between us, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, because it forces people to sit with what they just heard. And behind her I could see movement inside the office, someone picking up a phone, someone else whispering, the controlled environment she depended on starting to crack at the edges. And the thing about cracks is they spread, slowly at first, then all at once, and standing there with my hand resting on that tractor, feeling the warmth fade from the metal as the engine cooled, I knew this was no longer a small disagreement. This was the moment where everything she built her authority on was about to be tested in front of everyone watching. She did not argue again right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because Brenda Whitmore was not the kind of person who paused unless she was recalculating, and I could see it happening in real time, her eyes flicking from the sign to the tractor to the small crowd gathering along the sidewalk, each new person adding weight to the moment, each phone raised turning this from a quiet enforcement into something public, something that could not be quietly filed away or rewritten later. And that is when the door behind her opened again and a man stepped out, mid-40s, pressed shirt, the kind of guy who spent more time in meetings than outside, carrying a folder like it meant something. He looked at me, then at the tractor, then at Brenda, waiting for direction, because that is how systems like this work. There is always someone waiting to be told what to do. And when the person in charge hesitates, the whole thing stalls. Literally in this case, stalled right behind 47 years of steel and diesel parked exactly where it was allowed to be. "What is going on here?" he asked, keeping his voice low but not low enough to avoid the attention around us. And Brenda answered quickly, too quickly, like she needed to reassert control before it slipped further. "Unauthorized obstruction," she said, already framing the narrative, already trying to put me back into the role she was used to, the problem to be corrected. But the man did not look convinced. He glanced again at the painted lines on the pavement, at the placement of the tractor within them, and then at that small zoning sign I had pointed out, and I saw it register. Not fully, not yet, but enough to make him hesitate, and hesitation spreads faster than confidence when people start noticing it. I reached into my truck parked just off to the side and pulled out a folded copy of the documents I had printed the night before, pages slightly creased, edges worn from being handled too many times in too few hours. I stepped forward just enough to close the distance without crowding them, holding the papers out in a way that was open, not confrontational. "County zoning records," I said, voice even. "This property is designated for commercial use, which means standard parking regulations apply, and there is no restriction on vehicle type as long as it is legally registered and stationary." I let him take the papers, watched his eyes move across the lines, slower than Brenda had read the sign, more careful, more deliberate, because some people still respect what is written when it is clear enough. And behind him I could hear the murmur building, neighbors talking quietly, pieces of conversation drifting through the air. "Did you see the fine letter? He owns that land. They cannot tell him what to do." The kind of talk that chips away at authority not with force, but with doubt. And Brenda heard it too. I could tell by the way her shoulders stiffened just slightly, the way her posture adjusted like she was trying to hold something in place that was starting to shift. "This is not over," she said, louder now, for the crowd as much as for me. "We will involve enforcement if necessary." And there it was, the escalation she relied on. The next step in the pattern. When control slips, bring in something bigger, something official, something that sounds final. And I nodded once, not resisting it, not backing down, just accepting it like it was part of the plan, because it was. I had expected this, counted on it even. "Go ahead," I said, simple, calm, and I stepped back, resting my hand again on the cooling metal of the tractor, feeling the last of the warmth fade as the morning sun climbed higher, because this was the part where most people would get nervous, would second guess, would start explaining too much. But I did not. I had read every line, checked every detail, and somewhere between the smell of diesel and the sound of quiet conversations building around us, I knew that whatever came next was not going to go the way she expected. The first thing you hear when enforcement is on the way is not sirens, not right away. It is the shift in people's posture, the way conversations tighten, the way phones stop pretending to be casual and start pointing more directly. And I could feel that change ripple through the small crowd gathered along the curb. The low hum of voices dipping into something quieter, more expectant, like everyone knew the next part mattered. And I stood there with my boots planted on that concrete, one hand resting against the tractor's fender, now cool to the touch, the faint smell of diesel fading into the warmer scent of sun hitting pavement. And I thought about the night before, sitting at my kitchen table under a single overhead light, papers spread out in front of me, zoning maps, county codes, sections highlighted. Not because I enjoy reading legal language, but because I have learned the hard way that if someone is going to try to use rules against you, you better understand those rules better than they do. And somewhere between the third and fourth page I found it. Not big, not bold, just a paragraph most people would skip, defining commercial lots as open to standard vehicle access without restriction on classification unless specifically posted. And I remember leaning back in my chair, hearing my father's voice in the back of my mind telling me to read it again, slower. Make sure, because details matter more than opinions. And now, standing here, that same paragraph felt heavier than anything Brenda could write on her clipboard, heavier than any fine she had tried to send my way, because it was not about arguing anymore. It was about alignment, about placing one fact directly against another and letting the difference show itself. And then I heard it, distant at first, a low engine sound that was not mine, growing just enough to pull attention toward the street, heads turning in unison, a patrol vehicle rolling slowly into view. Not rushed, not aggressive, just steady, like it had seen situations like this before and did not need to hurry. And I watched Brenda straighten slightly, that familiar confidence trying to come back, because this was her territory again, or at least she believed it was, authority calling. Authority, structure reinforcing structure. And for a second I could almost see the outcome she expected, the officer stepping out, taking one look at the tractor, asking me to move it, restoring her version of order, but I did not move, did not shift, did not prepare to explain. I just stood there, letting the moment unfold the way it was going to, because I had already done the explaining where it mattered, on paper, in code, in the quiet hours no one else sees. And the patrol vehicle came to a stop just off the curb, engine idling softly, door opening with that familiar click, and the officer stepped out, one hand resting lightly near his belt, scanning the scene not with urgency, but with curiosity, taking in the crowd, the office, the tractor, and finally me. And there is a certain kind of look people give when they are trying to understand before they decide, not rushing to conclusions, not reacting to the loudest voice, and I saw that in him, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the pause before he spoke, and in that pause I knew something Brenda did not. This was not going to be decided by who sounded more certain, this was going to be decided by who was actually right. The officer did not speak immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to make everyone aware of it, his eyes moving from the tractor to the painted parking lines, then to the office behind Brenda, and finally settling on me with a look that was not confrontational, just measured, like he was assembling the situation piece by piece instead of jumping to a conclusion. "Morning," he said, voice calm. "Even, what seems to be the issue?" And before I could answer, Brenda stepped forward, quick, controlled, her tone already shifting back into that polished authority she relied on. "Officer, this individual has parked a large piece of machinery directly in front of our office and is obstructing operations." Her words clean, structured, the kind that sound official even when they are not entirely accurate. And I let her finish, did not interrupt, because timing matters just as much as content, and the officer nodded once, acknowledging her. But his gaze did not lock onto me as a problem the way she expected. Instead, he looked back at the tractor, then down at the pavement, noticing the details that most people miss, the alignment within the painted lines, the fact that nothing extended beyond the marked space, the absence of any signage restricting vehicle type, small things, but small things decide big outcomes when rules are involved. And then he turned to me. "Sir, can you explain what is going on?" And I stepped forward just enough to be heard without raising my voice. "Yes," I said, keeping it simple. "This vehicle is legally parked on a commercially zoned lot, within a designated parking space. There are no posted restrictions regarding vehicle classification, and I have documentation if you would like to see it." I held the papers out again, the same ones I had gone through the night before, edges slightly worn, ink still sharp, and he took them without hesitation, flipping through slowly, not rushing, not dismissing, actually reading, and I could feel the shift again, subtle but real, the crowd leaning in, Brenda's posture tightening, the man with the folder standing just behind her now completely silent. Because when authority meets information, one of them has to adjust, and it is not always the one people expect. The officer paused on one page, eyes scanning a specific section, then glanced up at the small zoning sign near the hedge, connecting the two without saying a word. And when he looked back at Brenda, the tone in his voice changed just slightly, not disrespectful, but no longer aligned with her version of the situation. "Ma'am, is there any posted signage indicating restricted parking or vehicle type for this lot?" And that question landed heavier than any statement could have, because it shifted the burden, it moved the weight of explanation from me to her, and I watched her hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for everyone to notice. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then tried again. "This is HOA property," she said, as if repeating it would make it more true, as if saying it louder would override what was written in plain text on metal and paper. But the officer did not move with that. He glanced again at the documents, then back at the lot, then at the tractor, and I could see it settle in his expression, not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet conclusion forming. And in that moment the entire dynamic shifted, because it was no longer about what Brenda believed she could enforce. It was about what could actually be enforced, and those two things are not always the same. And standing there with the morning sun climbing higher, warming the back of my neck, the faint smell of diesel still lingering in the air, I realized this was the exact point I had been building toward, not confrontation, not argument, just clarity, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation. And once that clarity takes hold, everything else starts to fall into place. Brenda did not answer right away, and that hesitation stretched longer this time, long enough for the silence to turn into something heavier, something that pressed against the edges of her control, because the officer was not asking a complicated question, he was asking a simple one, the kind that has a clear answer or no answer at all. And I watched her eyes flick briefly toward the building behind her, toward the glass doors where her staff stood frozen, toward the small details she had never needed to justify before. And that was the moment it became clear, not just to me, but to everyone standing there, that there was no sign, no posted restriction, nothing physical to support what she had been enforcing for months, maybe years, just assumption layered on confidence. And when she finally spoke, her voice had changed again, still controlled but thinner now. "We maintain standards for the community," she said, choosing words carefully, like she could rebuild authority through tone alone. But the officer did not follow that line. He glanced once more at the document in his hand, then back at the lot, and gave a small nod that felt more like a conclusion than a reaction. "Without posted restrictions," he said, "the vehicle appears to be parked legally," and that was it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a statement placed calmly into the air that shifted everything. Because now it was official, not from her, not from me, but from someone whose role was to interpret what actually applied. And I could feel the reaction ripple outward, the quiet murmur turning sharper, more defined, people leaning into their conversations instead of whispering, phones lifting a little higher, capturing the exact moment the narrative flipped, and Brenda felt it too. I saw it in the way her shoulders squared, not in confidence but in resistance, like she was bracing against something she could not stop. "This is not acceptable," she said, louder now, projecting outward instead of inward, trying to reclaim the space with volume. But volume does not rewrite code. It does not change zoning. It does not erase the absence of a sign that should have been there if her rules were real. And the officer remained steady, not confrontational, just consistent. "Ma'am," he said, "if there are no violations of local ordinances or posted restrictions, there is no action I can take here." And that sentence landed with a kind of finality that did not need emphasis, because it removed the last piece of leverage she had been holding on to, the assumption that enforcement would default to her side. And standing there, feeling the warmth of the sun settling across my shoulders, the faint hum of distant traffic mixing with the low buzz of conversation around us, I realized this was the turning point, not because anyone raised their voice or made a scene, but because the system she relied on had just confirmed what I already knew, that authority without foundation does not hold up when someone takes the time to check it. And I could see it in the faces around me, neighbors who had probably received their own letters, their own fines, their own quiet pressure to comply, now watching something different unfold, something that suggested maybe those rules were not as solid as they had been told. And Brenda knew it too, because she was no longer looking at me like a problem to be corrected. She was looking at me like a variable she had not accounted for, something outside her usual reach. And the thing about variables like that is once they appear, they do not just affect one situation. They change how every situation is seen afterward. And as the officer handed the papers back to me, giving a small nod that felt almost like acknowledgement, I folded them carefully, feeling the weight of them shift from preparation to proof, because everything that had led to this moment was no longer just in my head or on my kitchen table. It was out here now, visible, undeniable, and impossible to quietly ignore. For a moment nobody moved, not even Brenda, and that stillness carried a different weight now, not tension, not uncertainty, but something closer to realization, the kind that settles in quietly and then refuses to leave, because once something has been seen clearly, it does not go back to being hidden. And I could feel that clarity spreading through the small crowd like a slow current, people shifting their stance. Conversations no longer whispered, but spoken just loud enough to be heard. You could hear it in fragments drifting through the air. "They fined him for that. There is no sign. How many times have they done this?" And those questions did not come from me. They came from the people who had been watching, the ones who had lived under those same rules without ever checking where those rules actually came from. And that is when I noticed Mrs. Dalton standing near the edge of the sidewalk, arms folded, her expression sharper than I had ever seen it. She had lived 2 houses down from me for years, quiet, kept to herself, always waved but never lingered. And now she was looking straight at Brenda, not with anger, but with something more direct, something like recognition, and she spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You told me my work van could not be parked overnight either." And that sentence landed harder than anything I had said all morning, because it was not about me anymore. It was about a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss than individual complaints. Brenda turned toward her quickly, that controlled smile trying to come back, trying to reframe the moment. "Different situation," she said, voice tight. But it did not carry the same weight anymore. Not after what had just been established. Not after the officer's words had drawn a clear line between what was enforceable and what was not. And more voices followed, not loud, not chaotic, just steady, layered, each one adding another piece. They fined my brother for a trailer. They told us our driveway was non-compliant. They said we needed approval for something already on our deed. And standing there I realized this was the part one could not have planned. Not really. Because while I had prepared the documents, the placement, the timing, what I had not controlled was what would happen once people saw it play out in real time. Once they understood that the rules they had been following might not have been as absolute as they were told. And the officer remained where he was, not intervening, not shutting it down, just observing. Because nothing being said now required enforcement, it required listening. And that is exactly what was happening. The quiet structure that had held everything in place starting to shift under its own weight. And Brenda felt it. I could see it in the way her posture changed again. No longer projecting outward, now trying to contain what was unfolding around her. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, attempting to regain control through explanation. But explanations do not land the same way once doubt has already taken hold. And I stayed where I was, not stepping forward, not adding anything to it. Because this was not my moment to speak. This was the moment where everything she had built was being reflected back to her through the people she had tried to control. And sometimes the most effective move is no move at all, just letting the truth sit there in the open air, undeniable, unfiltered. And as the sun climbed higher and the shadow of the tractor shortened across the pavement, I rested my hand lightly against its side, feeling the solid, familiar surface under my palm. And I understood something simple and clear. This had started as a fine, a piece of paper meant to pressure me into compliance. But it had turned into something else entirely, something bigger than a single machine or a single rule. It had turned into a moment where the line between authority and assumption was no longer blurred. And once that line is visible, it does not disappear. Once the first voice spoke up, it did not stop. It never does. Because silence in places like this is not natural. It is maintained, carefully, deliberately. And the second it breaks, everything people have been holding back starts finding its way out. Not all at once, not chaotic, just steady, like pressure releasing from something that has been sealed too long. And I could see it happening in layers. Neighbors stepping a little closer, no longer standing at the edge of the sidewalk but forming a loose half circle around the entrance. Their attention no longer divided but focused, not on me anymore, not even on the tractor, but on Brenda. And that shift was everything. Because control depends on direction, on keeping attention pointed where you want it. And now that direction had flipped. Now she was the one being watched, measured, questioned, and she felt it. I could see it in the way she straightened again, pulling herself up like posture alone could restore order. "This is not a public forum," she said, voice sharper now, trying to push the moment back into structure. "If you have concerns, you can submit them through the proper channels." And that phrase landed exactly the way it always had before, like a door closing, like a way to move discomfort out of sight and into paperwork. But this time it did not hold, because the problem was no longer hidden. It was standing right there in front of everyone, outlined by a tractor and confirmed by an officer, and Mrs. Dalton did not step back. She did not lower her voice. She just shook her head once and said, "We did," and nothing changed. And that was the kind of statement that does not need volume to carry weight, because it connects past experience to the present moment. It turns one situation into a pattern, and patterns are what break authority when they become visible, and I stayed quiet, not out of hesitation, but because this was exactly what I had hoped would happen, not chaos, not confrontation, but clarity spreading from one person to another, the kind that does not rely on me saying anything more, the kind that grows on its own once people see it for themselves. And behind Brenda, the man with the folder shifted his weight, glancing between her and the crowd like he was trying to decide where he stood, because that is what happens when the center of authority starts to wobble. People begin to reassess their alignment, quietly at first, then more openly, and the officer stepped back, half a pace, not disengaging, just creating space, allowing the situation to settle without forcing it in any direction, because there was nothing left for him to enforce. The rules had already been clarified, and everything unfolding now was a consequence of that clarity. And Brenda's voice came again, tighter, less certain despite the effort behind it. "We are reviewing all compliance policies," she said, choosing words that sounded official but lacked the firmness they once carried. And I noticed something small but important. She was no longer speaking to me directly. She was speaking to the group, to the perception, to the narrative that was slipping beyond her control. And that was the shift, the real one, because this was never just about a tractor or a fine. It was about who defined the boundaries of this place. And standing there with the sun now high enough to cast sharp shadows across the pavement, the heat beginning to rise off the concrete, I realized that boundary had just been redrawn, not by force, not by argument, but by something much harder to undo. People seeing for themselves that the rules they had been following were not as solid as they had been told. And once that kind of understanding takes hold, it does not go back, it does not shrink, it spreads, quietly, steadily, until the entire structure has to adjust to it. The moment did not explode, it settled, and that was what made it heavier, because there was no dramatic collapse, no shouting, no sudden reversal, just a slow, undeniable shift that everyone could feel, but no one could ignore. Like the ground had moved just enough under everything to make standing the same way impossible, and Brenda stood there in the center of it, still, composed on the surface, but no longer in control of how the situation was unfolding, and I could see it in the details, the way her grip on that clipboard had loosened slightly, the way her eyes were no longer scanning for mistakes in me, but searching for something to stabilize herself, something she could still claim as authority. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, not softer, not louder, just different, less certain. "We will be conducting a full review of all recent notices and fines," she said, choosing each word carefully like stepping across uncertain ground. And that statement was not for me. It was for the people around us, for the phone's recording, for the narrative that had already shifted beyond her control. And the reaction was immediate but quiet, nods instead of protests. Glances exchanged between neighbors that carried more meaning than any spoken agreement, because they understood what that meant, not officially, not yet, but clearly enough, that something had been wrong, and it was now being acknowledged without being directly admitted. And the officer gave a small nod, not approving, not disapproving, just recognizing that the situation no longer required his involvement. Then he turned slightly toward me. "You are good to stay where you are," he said, simple, direct, and that was the closest thing to a resolution anyone needed, not a victory declared, not a confrontation one, just a confirmation that what I had done stood on solid ground. And I nodded back once. No words needed, because anything more would have been unnecessary, and unnecessary words are how situations like this get twisted. And behind Brenda, the man with the folder stepped forward just enough to speak quietly to her, his voice low but urgent. And I did not need to hear the words to understand the tone. It was the sound of someone adjusting to a new reality, someone realizing that what had been routine was now under scrutiny, and that routine could not continue the same way. And the crowd began to shift, not dispersing completely, but loosening, people stepping back a pace or two, conversations continuing in smaller clusters, no longer centered on confrontation, but on understanding, on comparison, on connecting their own experiences to what they had just witnessed. And that was the part that mattered most, not this single moment, but what came after it, how it carried forward into every interaction that followed, how every letter, every fine, every instruction would now be read differently, questioned differently, and I stayed where I was for another minute, hand resting against the tractor, feeling the solid, familiar weight of it grounding everything that had just happened. And I looked at the building, at the glass doors now partially obscured by reflection instead of attention, and I realized something simple. Something my father had tried to teach me years ago without ever saying it directly. Respect is not something you demand. It is something that holds up under pressure. And what had been standing here before did not hold. Not when it was tested, not when someone took the time to look at it closely. And as Brenda turned away, walking back toward the office with a posture that was still upright, but no longer unchallenged, I understood that nothing about this place was going to feel the same for her again. Because once authority is questioned in the open, it does not return quietly to what it was before. By the time the crowd began to thin out, the energy had shifted completely, not gone, just changed, like the aftermath of something people knew they would be talking about long after they walked away, and I could hear it in the low conversations drifting across the parking lot, pieces of realization being shared in real time, people connecting dots that had been sitting there for months, maybe years, without ever being questioned. And I stayed a little longer than I needed to, not because I had something left to prove, but because I wanted to see what remained once everything settled, because that is where the truth usually sits, not in the loud moment, but in what is left behind after it. And what I saw was different from anything I had seen in this neighborhood before. People were not avoiding eye contact anymore. They were looking directly at the office, at the door that had been blocked, at the space where authority had just been tested and found incomplete, and that kind of shift. Earlier walked up to the door, not entering, just reading the notices posted beside it more carefully than anyone had probably done before, his brow slightly furrowed, like he was seeing something new in words that had always been there. And Mrs. Dalton remained for a moment longer as well, arms no longer crossed, posture relaxed but focused, and she gave me a small nod, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just acknowledgement. The kind you give when something finally makes sense, and I nodded back. Once, because nothing more needed to be said, and that was the thing about this entire situation. It did not end with a speech or a declaration. It ended with understanding, quiet, steady, and far more lasting than anything louder could have been. And behind the glass I caught a glimpse of movement. Brenda inside now, speaking with the same man who had stepped out earlier, her gestures controlled but quicker than before, like she was trying to reorganize something that no longer fit together the way it used to. And I could almost imagine the conversation, not about me, not really, but about what had just been exposed, about how to respond to something that had slipped outside the system she relied on. And systems do not adapt quickly when they are built on assumptions. They resist, they delay, they try to reframe, but eventually they have to adjust, because reality does not bend the way authority sometimes expects it to. And I looked back at the tractor, at the faded paint catching, the sunlight, at the small details I had grown up with, the worn edges, the familiar lines, and it felt different now, not because it had changed, but because of what it had revealed. It had not forced anything, had not broken anything. It had simply been placed in the right spot at the right time, aligned with the rules instead of against them. And that alignment had done more than any argument could have. And I stepped up onto the metal footplate, feeling the solid weight under my boot, hands, finding the controls without thinking, the same way they always had. And I paused for just a second before turning the key, looking once more at the office, at the people still lingering nearby, at the subtle but undeniable difference in how everything felt, and I understood that what had happened here was not something that would disappear when I drove away. It would stay, in conversations, in questions, in the way every future interaction would be approached. And as the engine came back to life with that deep, familiar rumble, I did not feel like I was leaving a problem behind. I felt like I was leaving a marker, something that had quietly reset the way things worked. And that kind of change does not need noise to last. It just needs to be real. You do not go back to accepting something just because it is presented with confidence. And I let the tractor idle for a moment as I reached my gate, the engine steady beneath me, the smell of diesel grounding, familiar, unchanged, the same as it had been the day my father first handed me the keys, and I could almost hear his voice again, not loud, not instructive, just there, reminding me of something simple. If you know what is yours and you know the rules that protect it, you do not have to fight loud, you just have to stand where you are supposed to stand. And I shut the engine off, the sudden quiet settling in around me. broken only by the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. Life continuing the way it always does, but with a difference that is hard to explain until you feel it. And I stepped down onto the gravel, boots crunching the same way they always had. But this time there was no weight behind it, no frustration, no lingering question about what might come next, because I already knew things would change, maybe slowly, maybe quietly, but they would change, because people had seen something real, something clear, and that kind of clarity does not fade. It settles in. It reshapes how decisions are made, how authority is questioned, how boundaries are understood. And I looked back once at the tractor, sitting there exactly where it belonged, not out of place, not violating anything, just existing the way it always had. And I realized that was the whole point. It had never been the problem. It had just been the proof. And as I walked toward the house, the morning sun now fully overhead, casting everything in sharp, honest light, I understood something that no letter, no fine, no clipboard could change. Justice does not need to be loud to be effective. It just needs to be accurate, patient, and placed exactly where it cannot be ignored.